Welcome to another episode of Ancient Geeks. I'm Tom Grant.
I'm Stephen Taylor.
And we always say that this is the podcast about geeks of a certain age, who are looking back on how we encountered all the different threads of the geekiverse that wove together and formed popular culture today, practically. And this time it's truly epic because we're going to be talking about the most epic part of geek culture in the 1970s, Star Wars, the first movie.
You mean
And
A New Hope?
A New Hope, when it was just Star Wars.
When it was just Star Wars.
Star Wars. So we always ask the question, what is the soundtrack that we wish we could afford for this episode? Did you
Oh,
have a suggestion
it's
for that?
John Williams all the way, right? I mean,
Yeah,
all the way.
I have another nominee.
Okay,
So
go
I
ahead.
would pick Bill Murray's classic Lounge Lizard version of the Star Wars theme from Saturday
Okay,
Night Live.
that's a good choice.
Star Wars, nothing but Star Wars.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's good.
but
That's
before we
good.
get into the big movie, let's talk about what we've been doing lately. So, what's something that you've been doing lately, geek wise, that you'd like to highlight?
So I'll highlight. So because of our conversation about Marvel Comics and specifically about your fascination with Thor, I decided to go back to the very beginning, and I've
Hmm.
been reading the Journey into Mystery run of Thor, which I hate to tell you, well, you may or may not agree, not very good.
No, it's not very good. It didn't get
Yeah,
good for a while. It
no,
took 20 some issues to finally get good.
and I do, and in fairness, and I did mention in passing, I've read some of the the really good stuff in the early in the when Thor became its own title, and but boy, I it's really that kind of interesting actually to me from a sort of historical point of view when I think about what was going on at the same time in say Spider-Man or in the Fantastic Four or a variety of other Marvel books that were, I think, more well written. This one is really cartoonish is not even the right word. It's just very simplistic.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing that some of the backup feature about the Tales of Asgard are a little more foreshadowing of what is to come later.
Hmm.
But it is, to my question at the time we were talking about Thor, it's kind of interesting the degree to which this weird mixture of Don Blake and Thor, and it doesn't really make any sense.
No.
Like, were you Thor before and you found the stick, but did you become Thor when you found the stick? I don't know. And the obsession with Jane Foster and Odin just not having it, man. I'm not having it with the
Right.
Jane Foster thing becoming this central
Yeah.
plot point was quite lame,
Well,
actually.
it's like they came up with this idea, and I don't know whom to blame for this. Was it Stanley or Kirby, but whatever. They came up with this, the setup being
Yes.
he's a god, he's a Norse god. He's a Norse god on Midgard, Earth. And then like they try to cram it originally into all the conventions of standard superhero
Yes.
comics
Yes.
for a
Yes.
while.
Yes.
Like he's fighting Mr. Hyde, just
Yes.
a hat guy who happens to be evil and strong,
Yes.
and the
Yes.
human Cobra. And it's just it didn't work, right?
Well,
And
to your point, I mean, it almost actually it just struck me. It really reminds me of the DC comics of the time,
yeah, oh,
much
very
more than
much.
the Marvel comics.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the main new geek thing that I've been doing lately. How about
Yeah.
yourself?
Well, a lot of things. I'll focus on one thing. I've been following the hijinks of Wizards of the Coast lately,
Uh-huh.
actually for the last couple of years, because it seems like they're just not able to figure out how to handle Dungeons and Dragons. And they've been really
Mm,
pushing this virtual tabletop because they want to turn a game that was originally played with just the rule book and some graph paper and dice and a pencil into something that the audience is going to be dependent upon having a computer program running on their laptop
right.
or their iPad or whatever, and having lots of downloadable content that they could monetize, and taking it from being the theater of the imagination
Right.
into just another video game like Call of Duty. And recently they just launched the virtual tabletop, which is supposed to be the point of the spear for this new corporate strategy, and apparently it's not doing too well. So look forward to comparing that to the original experience of playing D&D when we do that episode soon.
Interesting. No, I mean, it seems to me that if you can do holograms, I could accept it. But beyond that, this doesn't seem like a good
No,
idea. I
no.
bet if they were the Wizards of the Midwest, they would be doing this nonsense.
Good old salt of the earth people
That's
who are in the
right.
Midwest, not these coastal
No, you
elites.
can't. These coastal dudes messing things up.
Well, and they've been doing all kinds of other really unfortunate shenanigans would be a polite term for
Yeah.
doing some really crappy corporate stuff. So
I have paid almost zero attention,
well,
to be honest, and I still lament that I sold all my AD&D books.
yeah, I me too, but you can't hang on to things forever.
Oh, you can try.
Okay.
There's a whole show called Hoarders that does
I,
that.
God, don't get me started.
Sorry.
Anyway, okay, so let's dive into Star Wars, and I wanted to kind of just like preface this by saying a lot of what we do on this podcast is not providing you with an encyclopedic introduction to the different parts of geek popular culture that we talk about. It's starting with our own experiences.
Right.
What was it like? It's like an oral history of, what
Sure.
it was like to be there at the beginning. That's the intent. So for people who are looking for a deep dive into how Lucas, you know, premiered the first movie to his friends, and they all said that he needed to heavily re-edit it and other little bits and pieces about the production of the original movie. We're not doing that here. We are going to be talking about what it was like to be part of the groundswell of excitement around this movie that came out in 1977. And the one thing also I wanted to start with was, for me especially, I think, when I talk about Star Wars, I look at it, and probably you feel the same way. I mean, I look at it as the culmination of things that we were already in love with. It's one of the reasons why we didn't do the Star Wars episode first, so classic science fiction writers and their big ideas, or uh, science fiction on the screen, things like Star Trek or The Day the Earth Stood Still, or whatever, movies, TV shows, or whatever. But they were all kind of on the fringe at the time. These were not, with the exception of, to whatever extent, Star Trek was a big deal in popular culture when it was on, or Batman was a big deal when it was on. A lot of the kind of the precursors of Star Wars were on the fringe. Serials that the maker of Star Wars, George Lucas, clearly admired. I think that there were motifs from more popular kinds of popular culture that got imported into Star Wars. It was clearly influenced a lot by Westerns and
Oh,
samurai
yes.
movies and other things that were not fantastic, but there were also, the fantastic elements of comic books. We spent a lot of time talking about the Fantastic Four last time, and just, well, not the time before last, and just sort of the epic cosmic nature of those
Mhm.
stories. That I could see, you could see that finally on the screen with Star Wars. It was also the weird 1970s, when we had people who were very interested in things like psychic powers and uh, magic that you could do at home and so forth, and to whatever extent that resonated with the Force in the Star Wars movies. There just were a lot of things I thought at the time that was like, you went to the premiere of this movie and said, aha, so finally we're seeing a lot of this on the big screen in a way that everybody can enjoy.
Right. I mean, I think as it pertains to the theme of the podcast, very specifically, this is, without any doubt, the most significant manifestation of geek culture at a mass level in our early lifetimes, and in some ways is still, one of the pinnacles of that
Right.
example, right? I mean, this sort of everyone knows what Star Wars is, and you don't have to be a weirdo who likes knows what a Vulcan is and what Ponfar is or whatever to enjoy
Hmm.
this particular bit of culture. I think that so this is one of those cases where our relative difference in age, I think, changes to some degree, which the way in which we experienced this. I don't think it was quite as much of a culmination for me in the sense that I'd done, I was 9 years old when Star Wars came out.
Hmm.
And as we'll talk about, I think a little bit later, it resonated and was ever present for almost an entire year of my life.
Yes.
Um, uh, but
It was in the theaters and stayed there for a
Oh
long
yeah, yeah, no,
time.
no, no. It was absolutely, it was. I mean, very, very distinctly know that it premiered in May of 1977. I we'll talk about the experiencing it for the first time in a minute, but then I
Hmm.
know that it was in the theaters, at least in Temple, Texas, on my 10th birthday in July of 1978.
Hmm.
So it was around a long time. And and we saw it over and over and over again. But it was, I think to me, it was in one way it's certainly a major building block in the overall sort of geek tapestry, as I mix
Hmm.
metaphors
Yes.
of my life. Um, but it was this very distinct illustration to me, or so the very exciting experience of this seeing these kinds of events in a way, these kinds of stories in a way that really had not been done before, or at least, well, it hadn't been done before, period. The spectacle of it all, the largeness of it all,
Right.
that was, I think, helped further my geekdom. Um, and for me, it was like seeing the pieces, maybe a little ex post facto, right? There's like elements of, say, Asimov, certain terminologies, certain
Hmm.
ideas that influence what's in Lucas, but I didn't see that connect. I saw it ex post rather than
Right.
as a culmination.
Yeah, I mean
So
there were lots of books with galactic empires
yes,
and blasters and so forth.
yes,
I would kind of point to books that I'm sure nobody I knew read other than me and maybe my mom and stepfather. Were things like the Ensign Flandry series by Poul Anderson, or the Retief series by Keith
right,
Laumer, or the
right,
Lensman series by Doc
yeah,
Smith. That these
right,
were things that seemed like very familiar territory when they were on the screen
right,
in the incarnation of Star Wars.
correct.
Yeah.
But
All
mostly
right.
that which I would have encountered, I would have encountered after, while you encountered it before. It's an interesting sort of
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
circumstance, I think.
Okay. So, when did you first hear about Star Wars? I struggled with this. Like, how did you find out this was a movie that you should go see?
So the funny thing is, I again, I find all this very interesting. This whole this podcast and the process, and as you say, this oral history. As I try to really think about
Hmm.
my own biography, and there are things that I have very distinct memories of, and things that are a little mushier. The one thing I do have a distinct memory of is seeing a news story about this new movie that had clips from the movie, and
Yeah.
getting very excited about this space movie that was coming out.
Hmm.
And I would have been, again, been 9 years old at the time. I do remember very also distinctly thinking that the Millennium Falcon was the Death Star. All I heard was like, I saw the ship. There was some reference to a Death Star. That must be the Death Star. I don't know. Um, I do not remember though going to I saw the movie. I know the first year at least 6 times, perhaps more. But I do not remember the. I remember seeing the Star Destroyer for the first time,
Hmm.
but I do not remember what theater I was in. And there only were two choices this could have been in where I lived.
Okay.
So it was not like,
It's a coin toss.
and I don't remember like anticipating going to the movie that day. That part I don't remember. Although I still remember seeing it again multiple times. How about yourself?
Yeah, I couldn't pin down whether it was an ad that that kind of alerted me to Star Wars, or whether it was maybe just kind of the buzz, in the comics world.
Right.
People knew that this space opera movie was coming out. Somehow I became aware of it, but I don't recall that in the Southern California
Hmm.
market where I lived, that there was a lot of publicity before the premiere. I don't think it was heavily marketed, which made it very stunning to me that the theater was jam packed and there
Right.
was a line, for the next showing already there, as we were going in for the first movie. So I'm not sure why that it had that kind of first day explosive popularity, but there it was. And in
Right.
fact, so just to kind of jump to what the experience of seeing it for the first time was, you mentioned the Star Destroyer. So I went with a friend of mine who was a regular customer at our bookstore, and we wound up having to sit in the front row.
Oh
of the
wow.
theater. And so when the Star Destroyer comes overhead, you know, basically we were just agog, just
Yeah, yeah,
looking
yeah.
above us, just like, oh my God, the screen towering above us, and the Star Destroyer coming overhead, and the space battle happening. Uh, that was just sort of a mentally and emotionally pulverizing moment.
Yeah, yeah. I think, I mean, I remember again in my 9-year-old head, I do think I kept trying to figure out what the Death Star was. So like, is
Mhm.
this the Death Star? But but I do remember also that when the first ship flies over, and this is where unlike in Star Trek or even Doctor Who, when I can conjure all kinds of names, I don't remember what Princess Leia's ship was called. Anyway, the first ship flies over, and I thought that's really cool, and then the Star Destroyer comes, right? So it's like the effects even of the first smaller ship were impressive to me
Right.
compared to watching even Star Wars, Star Trek, or various other shows on TV. And then it was just like we ramped it up quantum levels when the Star Destroyer comes over. Right? It was very, and then of course the whole scene, the ship being sucked in and Darth Vader coming through the door was just I certainly never seen anything like it.
No, nothing like it. Well, you know, you'd seen like bits and pieces of it,
Right.
if you watched a Buck Rogers serial, or Flash Gordon, a tiny little suggestion
Sure.
of the
Oh
sort
yeah.
of, kind of colossal impression that the opening of Star Wars made. I'm glad you mentioned also like Darth Vader's entrance was
Oh yeah. It's
just
just
awe-inspiring.
yeah, yeah. The whole thing was wild and like who is this guy? And he's towering and he's you don't know what's going on really, right?
No, not
I
at
mean,
all.
obviously he's bad because he's tall and evil looking, and there's
Right.
like ominous music. But I
And
mean,
he's
it's
wheezing.
the wheezing. Yeah,
Never trust wheezing people.
apparently that's never a good idea.
Only evil people wind up in iron lungs.
That's right.
It's just common sense. Yeah, I also I just for this episode, I looked up what the trailer might have been like,
Oh
that I
yes,
saw. There were multiple versions of the trailer. I'm not sure how to trust what is on YouTube, but
right.
there was a really interesting one that did not have the John Williams music. It had this sort of very, again, 70s style soundtrack that sounded more like the Alien soundtrack than what we attribute to Star Wars.
I think I've seen that one, and it's got a really sort of cheesy voiceover. It's not
Yes,
it's not the guy we got used to in the '80s with the very deep voice. It was not that
in a
guy.
world,
That's right, not that guy.
not that guy.
But I don't, again, I don't remember, I don't remember seeing it on TV. I don't remember it
Me
being
neither.
advertised. I don't remember any of it. I'm, like I said, I'm 99% sure that it was, I saw this news story and I told my mother I want to go see this movie. And that's kind of where we
Yeah,
went.
it just felt like Star Wars was suddenly there, ex
Yeah.
nihilo. It just suddenly happened, and it went off like a bomb then.
Yes.
So you mentioned it was running a lot of time. So since we had a lot of people who loved the movie coming into the store, we had people who had seen it a dozen times,
Oh, yeah.
dozens
Oh,
of
yeah.
times. There was
Yes.
one guy who came in who said that he'd watched it so many times that he was able to interpret what R2D2 was whistling and beeping about. It was like he was saying something about the moisture farms putting off clouds. It's like, okay, man,
That
maybe
may have had some
maybe
chemical
take a
going on there.
pass on the next time you could watch
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was a thing, amongst my peers, like to compare how many times had you seen it.
Right.
And it was like, oh, I've seen it more than you have. I'm awesome. It was one of those deals. No, like I said, I know that it was. So this is part of my family lore. Um, well, again, I don't know when I first saw it, although I know I had to have seen it as I digress myself, but I know I had seen it clearly in '77. I distinctly remember as I did my little timeline here, like, I remember the Donnie and Marie show had a Star Wars episode, and that was in
Hmm.
September of '77.
Okay.
I had tape recorded that thing and played it over and over again. That's the closest I could get to some other Star Wars was Donnie and Marie and Chris Christopherson and Paul Lynde singing songs about Star Wars. It's if you haven't seen it, folks, Google it. I'll
I
try to
have
remember
not
the.
seen this.
Oh, oh,
There was no chance I would have watched Donnie and Marie at the time.
no, we watched Donnie and Marie, and which is, speaking of the weird, when you mention the weird '70s, I know you're right. Of course, it's the psychic stuff and it's Bigfoot and the Boggy Creek monster and all that stuff. But to me, the weird
Right.
'70s also means really bizarre, terrible variety show television that everyone watched.
Oh man, the
Uh,
Sonny and Cher show.
so yeah, that. But Donnie Marie, we watched. I don't, we watched Donnie Marie in my house, and it's a whole. Oh no, if you haven't seen it, you're in for a treat. It
Okay.
is bizarre, and it's a musical thing. They had Donnie is Luke and Marie is Princess Leia. They've got
Hmm.
the robot. The droids are there. There's a Darth Vader. Although, Darth Vader, the costume, at least I don't think he was Dave Prowse. But Paul Lynde is Grand Moff Tarkin, and Chris Christopherson is Han Solo, and it is truly bizarre. Clearly it was still on the point where they felt like they needed to promote this movie because they had real stormtroopers were on set. The costumes,
Hmm.
it was just bonkers.
That's
Oh
pretty
yeah,
psychedelic, man.
Red Fox was Obi-Wan Kenobi, except he was something like Oki Binoki Finoki or something like that. Anyway, the swamp in Florida that I think
Are
I
you sure this
mispronounced.
happened? That you
It
didn't
de-
hallucinate this?
oh, it happened. So anyway, my point being is I try to sort of figure out, you know, because it gets very co-located in my head with 1978
Yes.
because in 1978 my twin brother and sisters were born almost exactly 10 years after I was born. So that summer is burned in my brain. And so again, my brother may be listening. I think I've gotten over it now, but they ruined my 10th birthday party. It's just true. Um, Very
Those
sad.
things stick with you
It
forever.
just, I did get Baron Karza. Speaking of geek things, I got a Baron Karza Micronaut for my birthday in my 10th. So it's all, it all works out.
Okay.
Regardless, so my younger sister, though, the older of my younger sisters, the one that was, not the baby, we were sitting around and my mother talks my dad into taking us to the movies. Well, and to go see Star Wars, which we'd already seen 1,000 times. Another reason it's burned in my brain is because my mother was very pregnant that summer. All of her friends took my sister and I to the movies all summer long. We saw Grease 3 times that summer. We
Mm.
saw, Star Wars multiple times. I don't know what else we saw, but anyway, and we went to the movies to go see Star Wars. And this is July of 1978.
Right.
It's been in the theaters for over a year, but they'd built a new movie theater in Temple, Texas,
Hmm.
and there was a line around the building to see Star Wars.
Yes.
And my sister pipes up in the back seat and says, "So, Stephen, how many times have you seen Star Wars?" And my dad goes, "You've seen this already? We're going home," because the line
Oh
was around the
man.
building. Which was disappointing at the time, but it's been a great story for the last, 40 something years. Anyway, regardless, yeah, it was still popular enough in a year after to have a ring of people around the building to watch this movie.
Yes.
And so that was pretty impressive, And so anyway, that was
Yeah.
my
And
tale of
it was an era, when people did line up for movies,
yes.
and also when, as you said, people saw movies multiple times. And I think, the other movie from the same time period I would cite that kind of played out that way was Jaws.
Mm. Which
It
I've never
was,
seen.
oh my God, you've
This is
robbed
your
yourself.
this is your opportunity to tell me this episode that I'm dead to you.
No, no, I won't say that. There'll be something else you say later that
Sure,
will
that's okay. Fair,
undoubtedly inspire that.
fair enough.
It was, a movie that was a phenomenon,
Yes.
and and people did line up for it, and
Oh
it
yeah.
was in the theaters for a long time. There were other movies like that too. I think, like The Exorcist was kind of like that.
Hmm.
And it was also one where it's like you didn't want to tell anybody what happened in the movie. Just like go see it for yourself. By the way, I'm really almost have a fanatical uh, ethos about not telling people anything about a movie that's good. Right? I'll happily spoil bad movies, but if it's even just a decent movie, I will not give away any spoilers.
I think we'll talk about the biggest possible spoiler of all time in the next episode.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Okay. So anyway, there was a lot of unofficial merchandise out at the time, and but this is skewed a little bit by the fact that we had a bookstore and
Right.
comic store that specialized in science fiction, fantasy, superheroes, and so forth. But it wasn't just there. I mean, I knew other people who had put together something that looked like a Jedi robe, or even kind of came up with a homemade lightsaber. Didn't light up necessarily, but you could go zzz as you waved it around. I remember one time, like, with some people who were friends, who came by the store. We all dressed up, and we were having sort of like a Star Wars party at the store, and we walked into a convenience store nearby, all in our regalia. Like, this one girl I had a crush on was wearing a Jawa costume, and anyway, it just inspired a lot of people to
Yes.
do things for their love of the movie, whether it was lining up again for the
Mm.
30th time,
Oh
or
yeah.
yeah, or making your best attempt at a Han Solo style blaster, uh, like no other movie I could remember from that
Yeah.
time.
I was too young to have done some of that, or just didn't. The only thing I do remember that anytime there was a used up wrapping paper roll, a
Yeah.
long cardboard tube, it automatically became a lightsaber.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
That was just the way it worked.
Well, and there were so many kids who, if YouTube had existed at the time,
Oh
would have
yeah.
had would have been the Star Wars kid, right? The
Yes,
the, the the
absolutely.
infamous Star Wars kid
Yes,
video, the kid in his garage.
absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I mean to that point though, I mean, right, it did inspire in ways. It became all this became more mainstream. All this stuff became more mainstream. It's still obviously, I think, probably if a gaggle of kids showed up in your convenience store all dressed like rejects from Tatooine, you might think you're a
Hmm.
little odd, but you knew what it was. If they all showed up
Right.
in like Star Trek regalia, you might not know what it was,
Yeah.
especially if they were slightly off the beaten path, in a Romulan costume or something. But
Right. If you take a refrigerator box and turned it into an Iron Man costume, you
yeah,
probably would have had many more arched eyebrows than you would have
or
had if
a ridiculously floppy hat and a long, long scarf. No one would have known what it was.
exactly.
But if you dress
Exactly.
like a Jawa, people know what you're up to.
Right. It's funny, like, having the bookstore just reminded me, like, we already had people who would come into the store in not exactly costume, like there were, or something that was definitely a costume. Like, we had a
Right.
guy who came in with wearing a kilt all the time. It's like, really?
Sure.
And
Y-
he would pick out comics, and be prone on the floor reading them and laughing his head off. That's
That
an image that doesn't go away.
that's that I would think not. He was just
That's
proud of his clan.
that's it exactly. All right. It also, as it was talking about blockbuster summer movies, I think this really cemented that. Like, this and
Oh, totally,
Jaws
totally.
kind of created. Yeah, of course, I can't speak for the movie studios themselves, but in our heads, we all thought, well, now we're going to get some sort of big
Oh yeah,
pulpy movie
yeah.
during the summer. That's going to be the norm from now on.
Oh no, I think in many ways we still live in the universe this all created, right? In fact, that's largely what's left of movies now are these epic big tentpole movies that try to draw in huge fans, and it often is geek-oriented stuff that does it.
Right.
So we conquered the world and now we're suffering for it in some ways.
Yeah. But the two movies we're talking about, I don't recall anything ever indicating that Spielberg or Lucas tried to make them into that, right? They
No,
were
I
just
I
doing a
agree.
movie they
I
thought
agree.
would be great, that they would enjoy themselves.
Yes. No, no, I agree. I guess not to be glib, right? But I think, and obviously it all carries on from here, and I'm not going to do this in the right chronological order, but whether it's E.T. or Indiana, the Raiders of the Lost Ark or the Indiana Jones movies or various other movies, Superman movie, which was actually comes out not long thereafter, I guess. Um, and obviously we talked about a little bit of Star Trek: The Motion Picture was an attempt to capitalize on this, but this
Right.
it starts to drive this, and it tends to be genre oriented stuff because it is it's an economic calculation at this point. These movies made a bunch of money, and this adventure oriented stuff has mass appeal. And I joke about being doomed to the world we're in now, but I mean the reality is with because of the nature of home entertainment, streaming, large televisions, good sound systems, and peak TV as you know as it exists now, it's hard to draw people to the movies to watch some art house film. But
Right.
but they will go see big explosions because the explosions look better on the big screen. And so, I mean, we talked about in the first episode, I think, like, if you look at all of the top grossing movies in the last several decades, they're almost entirely all genre movies.
Right.
And so on the one hand, that's cool in the sense that, to the point of the podcast, that the geek culture has become mainstream, but it also has, I think, in some ways, diminished what the, what movies what kind of variety of movies that might be released that used to be more the
Yeah.
case.
Well, I sense this will be a theme for
Yes,
us that, when people weren't trying to make blockbusters,
yes,
that they were more likely to make a great movie that would turn into a blockbuster. Now kind of the humming machinery of
yes,
producing these tentpole movies and so forth are less likely to produce something great. And in part it's because everybody wants to be safe.
that's right.
Just keep rehashing the same
Well,
thing
yeah,
over and over
exactly.
again, including, kind of later Star Wars efforts.
Correct. No, that's the point, right? I mean, to your point that you said about Spielberg and Lucas just making these movies they would wanted to see. I mean, Jaws was not some franchise. Star Wars was not some franchise at the time.
No,
And or even E.T. or various other Spielberg movies, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Um, these were all new and original. I mean, I'm sure we stop and think, and I didn't stop to think, but I mean, the number of truly original movies of this nature are a lot more limited. They're more franchise-oriented films and have been for quite some time.
right. All right. What did you like about the movie when you saw it?
So, I mean, so many things. I think it was one, I mean, and we've already talked a little bit about it, visually was unlike anything that I had seen.
Hmm.
It had taken the sort of hinted at stuff on television, um, and was showing it to me. We saw the ships in combat. We saw the ships flying through space. We saw various activities taking place that often, if it happened on, say, even Star Trek, you kind of only got a hint of it.
Right.
Um, but you saw it in its totality, the sort of mystery from the beginning of who are these characters, what's going on, who's this Darth Vader guy, why
Hmm.
do they attack this ship, why do they want these droids, all of that stuff was appealing, and then just the cast of characters was compelling. Whether it was Obi-Wan Kenobi and who's this guy, Han Solo, et cetera, all the way to the climax, which was, of course, quite impressive. And it
Right.
sounded great, right? Sounded fantastic. Loved the music. Had the double album and
As did I.
played it over and over and over again.
Yeah, it was nonstop spectacle for one thing.
Yes.
I
Oh,
mean,
yes.
without getting into the science fiction-ish elements, it was just, yeah, as you said, the music, the action, the special effects, the everything,
The sound effects,
the
the
sound
way the way
effects,
the
the
blasters
makeup.
sounded, those
Right.
lightsabers, it all was just amazing. Yeah, make
Yeah,
it,
just and as you said, it didn't bother to explain everything. It was
nope.
like, hey, let's stop everything for an exposition dump.
That's right.
So who's this Bigfoot-like character standing next to Han Solo? Just like,
Yeah.
let's not even explain that.
Yes.
Or they
That's
didn't
right.
have to have an origin story for Darth Vader, or they,
Right.
didn't get into the politics of the collapse of the Republic. It's just,
Right.
it wasn't necessary for the story, which
That's right.
this is such a hobby horse for me. So
Yes.
forgive the rant here for a moment, but that is the ultimate mistake I think of a lot of movies today, is that they just can't stop doing the goddamn prequels, or you have to like stop the action for a moment to give a lot of unnecessary exposition or
Right.
backstory.
Right.
Just run with it, man. Just run with it.
No,
Because
yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was gonna. I mean, I was gonna agree and dissent in part. Not even dissent's quite not the right word. I mean,
Hmm.
I think someday I would love to have. I think we do a whole episode on prequels and whether they're ever a good idea or not. I think I am maybe more naively interested in them than you are, although I'm frequently
Hmm.
disappointed. But you raise a good point, though, about you don't have to stop and explain everything. And in fact, sometimes explaining things is a terrible idea. For example, not to range beyond this movie too much, but midichlorians were a really terrible idea. We didn't
The
need that
worst.
much. We didn't need
The
that kind of
worst.
explanation. Some things need to be mystical, magical, and I was more than happy to deal with the way Kenobi describes it in this movie, which is it's just a force that binds living things together, and you can access it if you have the right gift. I can live with that. That's cool. It's a bit magical. It's not fully science fictional if you want to go, if we're going to play that dichotomy, but I was fine with that.
Right.
And you're right that one of the, I mean, and I guess this hits the tension in question about all these things. And I've mentioned multiple times, and we talked about it, especially with the Lord of the Rings, but other places. I love the idea that there is information that can be found. The world is real enough that there are other stories that could be told, or there's other information that could be discovered. The problem becomes executing that's not always easy. But it also means that sometimes to illustrate the wideness of a world is that they just live it and you
Right.
watch it unfold, right? Um,
Abso-friggin-lutely.
I you don't have to explain everything, especially in the moment. And some things never have to be explained. Like again, I'm ranging a little bit here, but I didn't have to find out why Han Solo was called Han Solo. That seemed kind of silly. But anyway, um,
No, that's just a cash grab.
yeah, well, yeah,
Seriously.
that's fair.
Where his dice, fuzzy dice came
I
from.
always think
Uh,
of we've mentioned Harley Ellison before, and we've mentioned Hour 25, and I do not remember. It's just one of those things that sticks in my head what the context was. But he was talking about writing,
mhm.
and he was talking about a particular author. It's to your point, really, about the way it just happens. He was quoting some story, um, and the quotation was, "The door dilated and he walked through." That was the line. It's stuck in my head for
Right.
30 something years, 40 something years. And his point was, you didn't stop and explain what that meant.
Hmm.
That's just the way it worked in that context.
Right.
And you don't have to explain everything. And
Yes.
I do agree with that. And a lot of what happened in Star Wars was, okay, ancient religion, oh, old republic, oh this, oh that. Um, there's an empire, the
Right.
Senate's been dissolved, et cetera, and we just move on.
Hmm. Yeah, it's so I don't object to prequels or completely, and I think, what the one of the central questions that Star Wars left us with was, who is this Darth Vader guy? And then
Right,
we find out later, but
right,
it's not in gory detail. And we don't find out all the elements of Luke's parentage at that point.
right,
It's
right,
like,
right,
well, on this particular date,
right.
I
Sure.
was swiping through people on, galactic Tinder, and I found your mother, and our first date was blah 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 blah. Yeah, it didn't even go near anything like that. It's just, I'm your father, and you know it, right?
Oh, spoilers. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, everybody. But
No,
that's all it needed to be.
no.
That's all it needed to be. And to me, one of the great sins of modern Star Wars is that it took that sense that the galaxy was a huge place, that
Right,
there was always more going on. There
right.
was always something amazing just off screen. Like,
Sure.
if like the camera had panned to the right, that you would have seen something amazing that, was brand new and
Right.
interesting. But, and then just like reduced it down to the same places, the same characters, the
Oh,
same plots, the same Jedi, the same freaking everything.
I do agree with that. I mean, yeah, I think that it was just a very poorly done prequel.
Yeah.
Again, that's a whole
Yeah.
other conversation. I
I
guess
know.
here's the way I think about it. I think about prequels this way, if done properly, which is hard, and maybe sometimes, therefore, it's too hard and shouldn't be done. Um, I think if it's history, right? There's always like if you read the story of, I don't know, pick a historical figure or the Revolutionary War. There are other stories that exist that lead to that event.
Hmm.
So you should be able to go back and study that. That's history. So a prequel should be history, but it's often done very poorly.
Right.
And if it's done the way in which the Star Wars stuff was done in particular, which is we've got to explain weird minutia, and without really thinking through a good story,
Right.
then you've messed up. You've messed up very badly. And also sort of being aware when narratively you're so captured you really can't tell a good prequel.
Yeah.
Because if things are so predetermined you can't tell a good prequel, well then yeah, you shouldn't.
Well,
But
let me do a really geeky tie-in here.
sure.
So back in the day, when I was playing role-playing games, like D&D, but there were plenty of other ones. Kind of the convention was that someone would come up with a science fiction or fantasy background, and the assumption was you had to explain everything.
Right.
And so you were as a consumer of what the publisher was going to give you, you would buy these world books,
Right.
kind of would
Right.
explain everything you needed to know about this particular D&D
Yes.
setting or this particular science fiction setting. And at some point, not too long ago, a lot of people who were interested in just kind of using better storytelling techniques for role-playing games said, all right, throw those away, right?
Hmm.
Provide like a sketch of whatever the setting is, and then let the people who are playing the
Right.
games fill in the details
Sure.
and only fill in the ones that are interesting, right? Like, the fact that, again, spoilers, Darth Vader is Luke's father was dramatically interesting. And not only because of the shock value that
Oh
it
yeah.
had at
Yeah.
the end of Empire, but also then it set up all these interesting questions about, like, why didn't Obi-Wan tell Luke
Yes.
this? It
Yes.
it focused on the dramatic importance of that instead of just exposition for exposition's
Sure.
sake,
Oh
just
no,
like
yeah.
these
Yeah.
role-playing games said, yeah, if you're in some, D&D setting like the Forgotten Realms or Dragonlance, maybe some people's, like 1% of the people out there really just kind of want to read this deep background,
Right.
all the history of these invented worlds and so forth. But for the most part, people just want to have an interesting place to set their games.
Sure.
And when something is a detail that's needed for whatever reason, just fill it in on the fly.
Sure. 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 Um, yeah. Well, tell you what. Again, I think we're getting far afield, which is interesting,
Yes, we
and
are.
I'm afraid that if I keep talking, we'll get even further afield. So
Okay.
that's another.
I will stop myself from getting further afield.
No, no,
Uh,
I'm stopping myself. So there you
no,
go.
I'm going to do the same thing because I can
Okay.
realize I'm getting pulled down many favorite rabbit holes. Okay, so we talked about a lot of the things that we liked. I also just want to say in the realm of things you didn't need to explain. At the same time that Star Wars came out, you had not too much later, a couple years later, you had the alien xenomorph,
Right.
right? Which again wasn't explained, just the way Darth Vader wasn't explained initially. Or you had the Joker and Batman who wasn't explained. So there was, I think again, a lot of the power of it was just sort of things being there, suggesting questions, suggesting menace without necessarily showing
Oh yeah.
everything.
I think part of this boils down to, and I'm going to break my own what I just said I wasn't going to do, but I think it just boils down partially to how good of a writer certain people are,
Right,
and when you fill in gaps and when you don't, and how well you fill them in.
right.
I mean, I think Lucas's problem is he's not that great a writer, to be totally honest.
No, he's not.
But
Well, like they're famously, like Carrie Fisher, was asked what were the worst bits of dialogue you ever had to say, and she said General Kenobi. The speech, the projected hologram
yes,
from
yes, yes, yeah. Oh yeah,
R2D2.
yeah.
It just doesn't roll off the tongue exactly. All
No.
right. Well, back to things we liked. So the
Yeah.
production design certainly was
Oh
was
yeah.
a big deal, right? You not only had these spaceships that didn't look like spaceships you'd seen, or you had all these aliens who were really interesting, and very alien for a change, not the later Star Trek you have a funny nose or forehead
Yes.
for budget reasons, but also like the lived in look of things
Yes.
that should have been lived in, right?
That's
So
right.
yeah, the Empire was had a military organization where, of course, everything needed to be spit and polish. But if you didn't have your commanding officer looking over your shoulder, you might let things slide a little bit and get kind of dirty and messy and used looking.
No, it looked much more real. Everything on like Star Trek is like everything's pristine,
Yeah,
no matter where you go, um, on balance. And Star Wars didn't. It looked more like real places. That was one of the grand appeals of the whole thing.
yeah, and the whole thing with the Jawas and the sort of
Yes.
the Carmacks of robots that they had was great.
Oh,
All right,
yes.
anything else that you really liked that was worth kind of calling out?
I think we covered all the
Yeah,
important
I just would
things.
add one or two other things. One would be it's hard not to like an underdog story.
That's
You know,
true.
the kind of the motif of the first movie was great. Also, the redeemed rogue character, I think, kind of
Oh,
hits
yes.
hit some buttons with me. When Han Solo and Chewie swoop in, really was a cheer in the movie theater moment.
Oh, absolutely. I actually one thing I did think of this was I don't know if it was the height, but it was certainly compared to now because things have changed. The model work in the movie is incredible
Yes,
because it's all models. It's
right,
and it's not CGI and at least not in the original version. I know some things were changed later as Lucas tinkered, but it was really very very impressive in that sense.
right,
And it was the kind of thing that I remember like shows like 60 Minutes would do stories about the model work on Star Wars or whatever. It was
right.
like
It was
pretty,
incredible.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And he also got a sense immediately with the movie, which was part of like what kind of drew you in to kind of want to find out more about this because this was very overt, that it was a collaborative effort.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
You know,
That's
you
right.
had you had, publications with Ralph McQuarrie's drawings
Yes.
that got translated into the movie, or you knew that Industrial Light and Magic was this company that did this amazing model work. It was more than just, well, it's George Lucas and his vision.
Yeah, and it was also the sense that they were inventing something, a new way of making movies.
Right.
And that it had because ILM in particular was something that was sort of being created in this process. I still remember again, I think it actually was 60 Minutes. I can't remember if it was some other TV news program, but I remember watching the story about because at that point in my life, anything about Star Wars I would watch, right?
Right.
And it was like I remember watching a story about John Williams and but anyway, but they were talking about building the Death Star and just buying model kits, you
Hmm.
know, tanks and aircraft carriers and planes and using the bits and pieces to build the uh, the, the
Right.
surface of the Death Star because they didn't have any way to fabricate them.
Hmm.
And sort of the very entrepreneurial, I guess, sort of way in which they went about creating some of this stuff early on, that became this machine that could produce these kinds of movies
Right. And you were
was
interested in
impressive.
what ILM would do next.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And the other thing I would just say is that the title was perfect. It was
Yes.
simple, straightforward, two words, told you all
I,
you needed to know.
I was going to make another New Hope joke. Anyway, yeah.
I know, yeah, but I think that I don't love that
I
decision.
I agree. I
Okay.
agree.
So was there anything you didn't like at the time?
I mean, at the time, I don't, I can pick it apart ex post. I don't remember anything at the time striking me as uh, something I did not like at the time.
Mhm.
How about yourself?
At the time, I really was aware. I remember that Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher were not great actors.
Right.
There were moments, and you could blame Lucas or you could blame the dialogue, Lucas as a director or blame his dialogue, but it just was like, huh, that didn't land too well, that particular line.
No,
Whiny Luke
Luke
especially
was
was
whiny. Yeah. These are things that when I said at the time, I mean, my 9 year old me was like, Luke and Lee were awesome, and that was fine.
right.
And Han was great. But I certainly, yeah, ex post, you can. not only within the movie itself, but then of course it's not like Mark Hamill, who I adore and was great, say as the Joker on the Batman
Yeah.
animated series, hasn't exactly had the acting career of Harrison Ford.
No, no. And
Um,
that was obvious that
yeah,
Harrison Ford was the much more appealing actor. And of course, there was also Alec Guinness,
yes.
which I don't remember being as aware of Alec Guinness at the time as certainly I was later. But Peter Cushing,
Hmm.
since I was a monster movie kid and I watched some Hammer movies with him, and it's like this guy's a good actor.
And to
He's really
tie into
great.
last week's episode, he's the one that played Doctor Who in those two terrible movies they
Oh,
made in
that's
the
right.
1960s.
That's right, which I've never
And
seen.
his name was actually in the movie, I do believe, Doctor Who.
Oh, oops. The other thing I didn't love, this is makes me sound like a snob, and probably
I
I
have that.
was. It was just like when people said that this was, science fiction, and it kind of was. I'm one of those people who thinks that these distinctions don't matter a heck of a lot,
Right.
but at the same time, it was. I'm glad that you're excited about this. This is space opera, which is a
Sure.
subgenre of
Sure.
science fiction, but you wouldn't say Arthur C. Clarke or, you Larry Niven or Isaac Asimov and so forth were really what you were seeing when you were watching Star Wars. And I was glad that it might inspire people to go see
Right.
that, but it was just like the conflation of all these things. I wouldn't say it was like a big problem with me, but there was just a lot of people who were like pronouncing about science fiction who had probably never read a science fiction book in their life. And that rubbed me the wrong way when that happened.
Well, yeah, so that's that's geeky gatekeeping there, Tom.
I am. I was a geeky gatekeeper. I learned my lesson. I don't care about these things anymore. I
But
just
yeah,
don't.
yeah, yeah, I hear you. It's kind of like some of the debates that started to erupt at the time between Star Wars and Star Trek fans.
Yes.
Like you had to choose. Like I don't know why you have to
Yeah,
choose.
stupid. I
Yeah,
just, I also didn't want people to be disappointed if they read something that wasn't like Star Wars. It's like,
right.
well, give it a chance. It's a really different sort of story. Like if you read Childhood's End, it's a very different sort of story, narrative than Star Wars. Just
Right.
be ready for that. Okay, so we talked a lot about the impact of it, but let's kind of talk about maybe the imitators.
Oh yes.
So there were a lot of imitators of Star Wars, not surprisingly, because that's the way that Hollywood works. Something gets big, and suddenly you have a lot of cheap knockoffs or
Yes.
expensive knockoffs of
Yes.
them. Were you much of a fan of the knockoffs?
So I mean, the knockoff stuff that I consumed was predominantly stuff on television, and of course, one of the big ones, and you've listed it in the show notes, which is Battlestar Galactica. That was,
Right,
you know, very obviously um, a ripoff of Star Wars.
right,
Let's take the X-wings and take the wings off of them and call them Vipers. No one will
right.
notice. But I remember watching the premiere movie. It was a big deal in my house. I had to stay up late to watch it because it came on a Sunday night and school was the next day, and
Right.
and watching the show. And Buck Rogers was another one that I watched.
Hmm. Bitty, bitty, bitty.
Yes, both of which really didn't. It's at the time again it seems longer than it is, but I mean neither one of them lasted very long. I mean Battlestar Galactica was one season, and then that terrible second season Galactic in 1980, which is, and then
It's
Buck Rogers was,
unwatchable.
it's really bad.
Yeah.
And
Sorry for
then
any fans listening, but
we just lost one listener.
I know.
Um, we happen to have the one guy that was
The
a
Galactica,
Galactica 1980. He was hoping that we were going to do a whole
right?
episode
He
of Galactica
created the
1980.
Galactica 1980 Facebook group, and he just like threw down his AirPods in
Just
anger and
walked
said,
away.
"I'm never listening to this again."
Um, and then Buck Rogers was only two seasons, and it was two very different seasons.
Yes,
Um, where it leaned heavily into Star Wars in the first season and kind of tried to duplicate Star Trek in the second season with a little bit of Star Wars stuff
right.
thrown in. It was kind of weird. What's some other ones that you recall?
Those are the big ones. I mean, there was also the movie a little bit later, Battle Beyond the Stars.
I remember seeing the
which wasn't
trailer.
a terrible movie. It was a fun B movie. The guy who wrote it, John Sayles, was actually a pretty good writer who went on to do lots of other really good things. But it was again, it's like so obviously
Yes,
this is a movie that would not have been made had it not been for Star Wars.
right.
And I think Roger Corman produced Battle Beyond the Stars, so it was certainly a deliberate effort to cash in on the Star Wars mania because that's what Roger Corman did. He
That was his
knew
move,
how to
without any
monetize
doubt.
things and not spend too much money getting there.
Oh no, and it was pretty obvious.
But it was also kind of like thinking about it now. It's like the Western. I was saying like the Western motifs in Star Wars. It's like Battlestar Galactica was wagon train.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's right.
Battle Beyond the Stars was clearly the Magnificent Seven. So imitation with a chef's kiss there.
And,
Um,
and of course, we got Star Trek: The Motion Picture because of Star
right.
Wars.
Yes. Which again, I think might have been not been a good movie in part because it was deliberately trying to be a blockbuster.
He was definitely trying to be a blockbuster. I watched, and again, I think this is a conversation for another day, but I'll mention I did watch part of it the other day just on a whim. And I realized also, because you keep mentioning the importance of 2001: A Space Odyssey
Hmm.
in this general conversation, in many ways, Star Trek: The Motion Picture is more trying to copy 2001 than it is trying to copy Star Wars.
Agreed.
Anyway, that's just a side observation for another day, perhaps.
Another day when we do 2001.
I I um I'm trying to remember, and this again, I didn't think to like try to research other bad movies from the era. There was something, was it Ice Pirates, Space
Oh yeah,
Pirates?
that's right. Ice Pirates.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
there were several like that I remember seeing trailers in the movie theater, but never actually. They always looked so cheap to me. I didn't want to watch them.
Right. I mean, that was, both science fiction and fantasy, a lot of at the time, evil overlord, being defied by ragtag rebel band. Krull
Yeah.
had a little had an echo of that. Anyway, there were a lot of things like that. Merchandising.
Oh,
This
this
is
is the
the
great godfather, granddaddy, whatever appropriate term it is of merchandising.
this is the volcanic eruption of merchandising.
Yes.
So there were magazines galore.
Yes.
So you could get stills, BV of the magazine of characters and shots and so forth that you really loved. There were the novels,
Yes.
starting with Splinter with
Splinter of the Mind's Eye,
yeah, by Alan Dean Foster. Um,
which was apparently written to be a possible second movie.
yeah. It was
It
it
was
was it was a decent novel.
I
It was a
remember
fun
reading
read.
it in middle school, I mean elementary school. That
Yeah.
was
There
although
were the
it hyped up the Luke and Leah romance angle though, so it ended up being a little problematic.
scary kids. There were the comic books. So Marvel Comics got the license to do the comics, and they did the adaptation of the movie, and then kind of continued telling
Yes,
stories about the characters, which were pretty decent as well.
they were.
Uh,
Read some of them after the fact. I don't remember reading them at the time.
yeah. I don't recall, like immediately when Star Wars came out, there being a bunch of toys. I mean, I think that was
Oh, no, they came out. See,
okay.
again, this is 9-year-old versus 15
9-year-old,
or
yeah,
16-year-old.
15, yeah.
Toys were no, they were. I remember the action figures, which were
Hmm.
hugely a big deal to me and my sister, being
Okay.
like in the grocery store. Oh, mom, look, and we just but only having like whatever the random ones were that were there. Um, and the main characters, but also like all the Cantina creatures were Star Wars action figures, all the droids.
Oh, there we go.
Eh,
1977.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
it
My bad.
was, no, this was, so for me, this was a hugely a significant sort of toy slash whatever. We played in with these figures for years. Had the land speeder. I think my sister had the X-Wing. Friends had various, the Death Star the play set
Hmm.
uh, that I always coveted and listed after, but did not have. So the action figures were a huge deal for us. And anyway, so that was yeah, that was very early on and very much. In fact, I had one of the I when the 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 Star Wars holiday special came out, which was in late 1978,
Hmm.
and they introduced the Boba Fett character in that cartoon. You could right away for the Boba Fett character, like from I think it was some cereal company or something. So I remember getting that was a big deal to get the Boba Fett thing through this offer where they used to do that kind of
Right.
stuff. So yeah, action figures were a huge deal.
Yeah, it might have been also that our store didn't sell them. That might have skewed my perception,
Mm,
aside from being older and not as interested in
right.
toys at the time.
And dollies. Um,
Yes, toys. Uh, there was also, as I said, a lot of unofficial and also I would say pretty much bootleg merchandise. Like we had like a lot of stills from the movie,
okay.
mostly black and white, if I remember correctly. And actually, that got us into a little bit of trouble
Really?
because then I don't remember why it was the case, but like these Secret Service guys came by. Like I don't know why they were involved in IP protection, but they came by and said, "Yeah, you can't sell those." Okay, we'll get rid of them. But anyway, there's a lot of that sort of unofficial
Wow.
merchandise, and there
Yeah.
were like Vader masks, at
Hmm.
the time. Um, just a lot of stuff out there that you could
Halloween
get with
costumes, the kinds you
Halloween
got in the
costumes.
box.
It was
Uh,
enormous.
One of my earliest pieces of merch besides the toys was posters. I had a big Star Wars poster
Oh yeah, yeah,
of the movie poster. That was a big deal.
yeah. I remember the Brothers Hildebrandt version of
Yes,
that
that's right.
being a big deal. That
Yes,
was an artist we mentioned back in the Tolkien episode for
that's
people
right.
who are paying attention. Um,
There'll be a quiz later.
The one thing, since we're really talking about the merch that we had, I had, which is because this was before you could get Star Wars legally or illegally on videotape. I had an like a 4 minute, 5 minute, 8 millimeter movie of the escape from the Death Star, so the
Oh
TIE
wow.
fighter
Yeah.
battle.
Hmm.
And there's again one of these things that you did because you love this movie, like like just like making your own costume or whatever. This was something like, okay, I had to go through the trouble of loading this up onto our
Right.
uh, otherwise unused film projector and then show it for myself,
That's right.
whenever
I
I
thought
felt
maybe
like
you were
doing
going
it.
to say that you had like a flip book or like a Morse code version of the movie, back in the
Mm,
day, the semaphore signal Never mind.
yeah.
Um,
No, just an eight
I
millimeter movie.
I do remember when it came out on VHS, it was incredibly expensive,
Oh yeah, that's
like
right. Yeah.
$100 or something like that,
Yeah,
which
it
at
was
the time was
pricey.
a lot of money. It'd be a
Yeah.
lot of money to buy a movie now for $100, let alone in 1980, whatever it was. But
Yeah.
yeah.
So there's any merch that you wish you'd had?
So yeah, I think that the things that there were no, to my recollection, there were no lightsaber toys. And even the ones that existed, I like
Right.
my brother and sister who were younger, they had the kind, there was one that was, it was plastic and you kind of flipped it with your wrist. It would kind of, the pieces would kind of come out and connect.
Hmm.
They're like segments. Each one was a little smaller than another one, kind of telescopic. They didn't have that when I was a kid. Now my kids had some that had like a tube that lit up and made noises. It was awesome. But that was many years later. I would have loved to have had some kind of lightsaber. Things that existed that I wish that Star Wars, the Death Star place that I would have loved to have had. There was a Han Solo blaster that I didn't have, and something else that didn't exist that I would have loved that came later were Star Wars Lego. I've mentioned my
Right.
passion for Lego. Now I built a bunch of stuff myself. I built my own Millennium Falcon out of Lego, but it was nothing compared to what came later.
Hmm.
That would have been like crack cocaine for me.
Right.
Oh, oh. If that had all the Star Wars Lego. How about yourself?
I would say if it would have to be something homemade, and I wouldn't have minded like coming up with a smuggler costume that wasn't just a copy of Han Solo's.
Right.
Something like that with a blaster or whatever. And again, we talk about the merch every episode because this is all a way of expressing and re-experiencing the things that we loved. It
Right.
wasn't just like we were mindless consumerist robots. It was, that there was sort of a talismanic aspect to these
Well,
things.
no, I think that's fair. And I think I mean, we made the joke about it being volcanic or the godfather of all, but it really was a way in which this became mainstream
Yes.
in a way that other things simply had not. I
Yeah.
mean, there were Star Trek toys, but there were not, again, my age, again, it's one of those deals where a few years can make a big difference. My age group all had all of those Star Wars action figures. And
Right.
it was all every wave of new releases that came out. And it was just really it's how we even knew what some of the that's how we knew what some of the characters were called.
Yes.
Now they made up the names, some of them which became canonical later, but like the red droid that we see at the Jawa at the Carmax
Hmm.
lot, R5D4. It's because the toy called it that, or the various
Right.
all of the Cantina characters were given names because you had to call the toy something. So that's how we learned what they were called. It was all part of this. I don't know that I knew anybody in my age group didn't have some of those toys.
Hmm. Yeah.
It just permeated.
It was a phenomenon.
Yeah. I will point out though, and I thought about this too, because while I'm not a big collector of stuff, I do have either things that I've kept and some things that I've acquired since or been given to me over time. I have nothing that I can think of that's Star Wars. I mean,
No.
again, I may post a picture of my board behind me. It is on it. If you're really interested, I made one very brief TikTok video uh,
Okay.
out there in the wild. But I have stills behind me of Doctor Who and Star Trek and even Blake Seven. There's a Blake
Hmm.
Seven one right there behind my head.
Okay.
I have none. I never bought any Star Wars. This stuff I bought many, many, many years ago, at cons and at comic shops and whatnot. Um, Probably some of this is the bootleg stuff that the Secret Service was upset about because
Right.
I
There we
don't
go.
think there's no way that Tom Baker thing was like not someone didn't just copy that off. Oh, there's an official NBC
Yes.
publicity still that I have. But regardless, I don't have I have in my office, I have some of my old Star Trek toys. I've got a couple of tribbles that I acquired over the years. I've got some Doctor Who stuff. I didn't keep any of my Star Wars stuff. Now, some of it, the toys, again, because I had siblings that were 10 years
Hmm.
younger, they kind of inherited all that stuff when I moved out and I didn't retain any of it. But it really wasn't like I'm not like upset that I don't have it.
Yeah.
Star Wars was important, and I continue to like Star Wars, but it is not Star Trek or Doctor Who or a variety of other things that really are more deeply important to me.
Yeah. And I think when we get into the next episode where we talk about the second and third movies,
Yes,
we'll inevitably talk about like how far can something like Star Wars go
right.
and how far should it go? Uh,
So
um,
tune in next week for the celebrity death match about prequels.
well,
No,
so I wanted to kind of wrap up on this question,
yes,
which was there was so we're talking about like going back to our mindset when we watched the first movie and
yes.
kind of the immediate aftermath of it. And there was an article, I think it was like in the BBC magazine one time that somebody wrote that really struck home with me. And what he said was, uh, Star Wars should have stopped with the first movie.
Mm,
And I wouldn't go that far,
no.
but if Star Wars, just to play the thought experiment out here, if Star Wars had stopped at the first movie, would you feel any differently about it?
Well, I think if Star Wars had stopped after the first movie, it would still be considered a classic summer adventure movie, or to use a term that a science fiction movie.
Hmm.
I think it would be
Sci-fi,
sci-fi with a Y,
skiffy, yeah.
skiffy. I mean, I guess maybe it'd be more like E.T. or some of the movies like that that really were um, just one off. But I think certainly, obviously, well, I'm just thinking like all these toys I'm talking about that all blossomed out of one movie. It became a
Right.
cultural
Yeah, it still would have
phenomenon
happened.
without Empire. Um, but obviously it takes on a broader life as a franchise that we can talk about next week, I guess.
Yeah, I think the comparison you made to ET is really apt. I would also say like 2001 or,
Yes, yes,
again, maybe not a science fiction property, maybe, a really great action movie of some type that,
that's right.
didn't need a sequel.
Yeah, I was
It would,
trying to
it
think
would,
of movies that didn't have sequels that are still standalone. And you named 2001's a good another good example. Um, I mean, I guess most movies that make any money end up with some kind of sequel.
right.
Um, I mean, I haven't, like I said, I admit I haven't seen Jaws. I haven't seen Alien. Um, I suspect that Alien or Jaws by themselves would have remained classics regardless of what comes next. And Jaws in particular, my understanding of those sequels are that they're so terrible, especially as time goes on, that you can just forget about them. Um,
Yeah, I think Michael Caine said, for example, well, somebody asked him, "What did you think of your performance in one of these Jaws sequels?" And he said, "Well, it paid for my mom's house."
that's right. That's exactly right. It's exactly right. So, I mean, there may be some other examples that I'm forgetting right now, but it would have clearly had a broad impact. Yeah, I think it's we can argue, and maybe we will argue about, what should have or shouldn't have been made and whether anything else should be made and etc. But yeah, I think stopping at the first one would have been kind of silly.
Yeah.
But
Well, I mean, I think that just the sheer momentum of Star Wars,
yes,
the phenomenon made the sequels inevitable, but
yes.
it still would have been a great movie without the
Oh,
sequels.
absolutely. You
Yeah,
could Star Wars by I mean, I guess to answer the question that way, but Star Wars by itself is a complete film and belongs in the pantheon of great movies, especially great action movies. But I think it's a great movie for what it is. Um, I mean, The Godfather is a great movie, whether you make The Godfather 2 or not. The
right.
Godfather 2 is a great movie too.
Yes.
Um, and some argue better than the first movie. That's
Yeah. And
fine.
it's
But
effectively one movie.
yeah, sure.
Godfather 3, on the other hand,
Yeah, yeah. Well,
ahem,
there you go.
ahem.
There you go.
Yeah. And I think that's when we talk about the sequels, we're going to talk about like how do you keep a franchise going and when should you know when to stop? Might be a topic for next time.
Yes,
If you can, right?
if you can.
Especially if there's like if you're printing money off this
Well,
franchise, of
that's what I
course
was
it
going to
might.
say. I
Yeah,
mean, there's an interesting. I mean, this is the political scientist in me starts to come out, which is there is uh, this is capitalism 101, right? I mean, it's
right,
going to keep going because of that factor. There, the quality question, the likability question, and the profitability question are not all the same thing.
right, exactly.
So there's that.
Okay. All right. Well, let's leave it there, and we'll
We'll leave it there,
continue in the next episode talking about Empire and Return.
and now I'm going to have Bill Murray in my head the rest of the day, but that's okay. There are worse things.
That's a happy thing. That's a very happy thing. It's like having a little guardian angel on your
There
shoulder,
you go. There you go. Well,
except he's a lounge lizard.
what? Yeah, never mind. Now that takes me a whole down another route. I'll stop right there
Yes.
and say we'll see you
No
next
more
week.
divergences, no more rabbit holes. We'll see you next time.
Goodbye.
Well, that's another episode of Ancient Geeks in the Can. Thanks for listening. You can find us on the podcast platform of your choice, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever else you like using. We're always grateful for a review on whatever that app happens to be. Reviews help people find us, and we could use that help. If you have kind words for us, or not so kind words for us, contact us directly at someancientgeeks@gmail.com. Look for us on Facebook, Blue Sky, and other social media outlets. All content copyright 2025, Tom Grant and Stephen Taylor. Music by Reversed Image, whom you can find on Pixabay. See you next time for the next 2 episodes of the original Star Wars trilogy.